Hello and welcome back to the Napoleonic Wars pod and another installment of our deep dive into the history of the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Kevin Linch makes a welcome return, as does my esteemed quartermaster, Liam Telfer. Liam, good to see you, buddy. How are you?
I'm very well, thanks, mate. Super excited. It's well overdue, this episode. It feels like we haven't had Kevin on for ages.
It does. But I'll be honest with you, I've completely lost track of time. So it could have been sort of 3 weeks ago, or it could have been 3 months ago for all that I know. But anyway, let's get down into it. Give us the esteemed bio of our esteemed Professor Kevin Linch.
Well, that's it. And also a huge congratulations to Kevin, who recently won the Templar Medal, the best book on British military history by the Society for Army Historical Research. So huge congratulations. Professor Kevin Linch, Professor of Modern History at the University of Leeds. As you all know, he specialises in the history of Britain in the 18th and early 19th centuries and focuses on the history of the British armed forces and their relationship to wider political, social and cultural trends. If you haven't already got it, you've been living under a rock. The prize for which the book for which Kevin won the prize, the British Army, 1783 to 1815, published through Pen and Sword. Go out and get that immediately. And Britain and Wellington's Army. And also, very interestingly, we've spoken about this offline, Kevin, your work with Dr. Simon Quinn on the British Army Officers database at georgianarmyofficers.org, which is fascinating. Thanks very much for coming back on, Kevin.
Not at all. It's good to be back.
Okay, who's going to scramble for the microphone first? Liam, I'll let you. Yes. I'll let you have first question.
Okay, cool. So we've talked about it with officers, and it's absolutely time to look at the rank and file, and something I am super passionate about this. Let's look at history from the bottom up. I just want to really start by talking about the type of men that went on to become soldiers and NCOs within the British Army. You know, none of these guys were born in a red coat. That, you know, they don't just exist on the battlefields of Europe. You know, what kind of backgrounds do they come from? How old are they? And what are their motivations for joining the army?
Yeah, no, it's great to be talking about, you know, the rank and file, as you say, and those that go on to be the NCOs again. I think one of the things that I'm really conscious about when getting asked this question and is about avoiding generalizations and just how many people we are talking about here. And I think it's just worth flagging that right up the front, really. We're talking about 750,000 men that went into the army in that, you know, the Revolutionary Napoleonic Wars. So anything I say that follows kind of comes with a massive caveat about, you know, we need to just be aware that there's always going to be different cases, always exceptions. You know, there'll be kind of people we don't know very much about, and there's others that we do. But having said all that, generally, what do we know from things like recruitment books, you know, where all this information is recorded? You know, we've done some, not just me, but others have done the stats on it and these sorts of things. Generally, kind of it is young men, you know, 18 kind of plus, early 20s, sometimes a bit older, sometimes into their 30s, but the army did set an upper limit about the age of men to recruit. One thing that probably is worth saying at this stage about them as well, and we'll probably talk about a little bit later on, is they have to be relatively healthy too. You know, and some of the things that we'll come on to later is about the sort of health of the soldiers and what we find out about the kind of population at this time in 18th century Britain, Ireland, and other parts of the world too. But yeah, where do they come from? You know, they tend to be, again, this all comes from the regimental books, which those that exist list all this kind of information. A lot of kind of working men, basically. They come from labouring backgrounds, some trade, you know, weavers, carpenters, and smiths of various kinds. So you've seen that they kind of are perhaps not that different from the way that the army had recruited throughout the 18th century, well into the 19th and in the 20th as too. With that kind of in mind, if you like, why do they join up? I think there's kind of lots of reasons. Not all apply to all of the men at the same time, and you know, there's different factors going on at different moments, but things you can see, I think, that are kind of obvious. One of them is money. There is a big bounty offered up front for joining the army. A wide men were attracted to that could be lots of reasons. Some of it can be that actually, the work that they had, the trade that they're in was on a downward slide. They couldn't get any work. And so a bounty like that would help them out. It kind of gets them out of that kind of financial hole. Others, it might just be simply that a recruiting officer turning up with a big bag of cash seems like quite a good thing to kind of sign up to at that particular moment. And some of them might go on to regret it later on afterwards. Other things that are there, though, I think, is some sense of adventure, just kind of breaking away from the boredom of everyday life. And again, that can link to their sort of working environment, if you like, already. They're looking at the next 5, 10, 20 years of doing exactly the same thing. And a recruiting sergeant turns up and starts offering them a lot of money and also starts promising them that they can, travel around the world for all these sorts of things. Then, that's going to appeal to some men at that particular moment. Related to their money bit, I think and this is again sort of, it's always thinking about like a work kind of, as a sort of trade, a contract that they were signing up to, is a bit about security too. A lot of the backgrounds of the men, where they were coming from, would have had insecurities about their working life. They wouldn't always be employed all the time throughout the year. There'd be dips in kind of the trade that they might be in, or they might be seasonally hired workers, particularly the agricultural sector. So although the army doesn't pay a lot, certainly in comparison to some other kind of trades, on the other hand, it is kind of, well, once you're in it, you get this money, or you should get this money for every day that you're listed, or at least you're owed it. It has some security there. And I think for that does, appeal to some people. And that's not just kind of young men who are kind of footloose and fancy free, as it were, but also some married men too. That this could be a way of finding a bit of security for their lives and for their partners and children and all these sorts of things. There are some special cases I think it's worth kind of mentioning about kind of recruitment at this stage, and probably come back onto some of these later on. One of them is kind of territorial recruitment, and I'm particularly thinking of kind of Highland regiments, where along with all those kind of examples you just talked about, there was a sense that a particular person, a laird or local landowner, it's not just exclusive to the Highlands, could request men to join, if you like. This gets romanticised, I think, because comes to a sense of fealty to that person, and we shouldn't really dismiss that. Alongside that went, I think, some kind of financial and social pressures. They were expected, a family might have been expected to provide a son for their layers recruiting unit, for the local landlords, new unit that they were raising. And if they didn't, you could wonder, if you were a family in that situation, would that be taken into account next time tenancies were up for kind of renegotiation? Basically, would they? Could they be, evicted from their land if they didn't do what this person asked? So there's a bit of coercion in some units, I think. And we shouldn't forget also that there were tens of thousands of enslaved West Africans who kind of had no choice about this. They didn't get a bounty, who were basically purchased by the British state and brought into the regiments that were sent to the Caribbean. So there are lots of kind of different reasons, different factors going on, some very particular cases as well. And I think probably the last thing I'd probably say about soldiers, they weren't born as redcoats. There were kind of, I think, probably some military families out there where there were traditions of service. So they weren't necessarily born into the redcoat, but their father might have served or their grandfather might have served. And there were, of course, sometimes people born into regiments who then go on to, be put onto the books as soldiers, and sometimes as boy soldiers too. So they get rations and kind of become official part of the regiment, even though they're very young. So it was a really long-winded answer, but you did start with a big question.
We don't do small questions on this show. You know that by now. It's funny what you say there in relation to the sense that some of them might have had familial connections, and there sort of might have been a sort of military tradition. And the emphasis that you put there was, that may have been the case, but it doesn't seem to have been at least we don't have evidence of it being a major impetus. And that just strikes me as a very stark contrast to what we see in the Bengal army, for example, where, Britain's Second Army, as I keep referring to it, there's a very different, we know much more about this kind of familial tradition. It's interesting to see that kind of difference, but it makes me wonder if there are any changes, I guess, as the army expands massively and potentially becomes more diverse. There's a big debate that's sort of sitting underneath that subclause. Does that have an effect on, the nature of recruitment? Who is being drawn in? Do you see lowerings of standards? And then, if we do see a lowering of standards, does that then see a trickle through in terms of a lowering of quality?
Yeah, they do play around with the standards, and what we're talking about there is the kind of height, particularly an age of sort of physical condition, that they do change those and lessen those, particularly the height requirements throughout the period. And that is a sort of sense of, they need more men for the army, and one of the ways that they could do that is, we expand the kind of pool that they can recruit from. Is about sort of population statistics of the time. Though interestingly, if you're looking kind of sort of the economic and social historians for the period, their evidence is that heights were declining generally anyway in this period. So the army is trying to keep up with the way that the population is kind of developing. But there is that sort of sense of the army, the horse guards and these sorts of things, expanding who can join the army. Though it never gets quite to the same levels is quite a wide way of putting it. As lower standards perhaps as the French army has, for example, in terms of heights and ages, through the conscription system. And I think there is a recognition particularly during the Peninsular War period, through the Adjutant General and the Horse Guards, that you can kind of have sorts of too small soldiers, in fact, too short or too old or too young, even though it's men on the books, actually being sent out to fight in somewhere like Iberia and actually going on campaign. It doesn't usually work out. They often become casualties quite quickly because of the physical demands that's placed on of actually campaigning overseas. So I think there's a realisation they can have different sorts of types of soldiers in some ways. So they do start thinking about sort of the older soldiers, for example, going to veteran battalions and sort of moved out. Some of the younger soldiers, shorter soldiers, are kept in units that are garrisons mostly. So second battalions or depot companies that are kept in the UK. So certainly they seem to be managing their, sort of human resources, if you like, much more closely, even though they have reduced the physical standards a bit to try and recruit more people.
I think that takes us really nicely, Kevin, to look at the processes, the sort of practicalities of joining the army. Now, our listeners will be super familiar, I've no doubt, with the scenes from Sharpe's Regiment when, the recruiting party hits town, and I know we'll be able to pull this apart and sort of and look into it in a bit more detail. But, how does joining the army as a private soldier work? How long does the process take? And I think on the flip side of that, looking at it from Horse Guard's point of view, how much of the army's time and effort is dedicated to the training of new recruits? In my opinion, you'd think it'd be really important, but the money tree has only so many leaves, right?
Sharpe's Regiment in some ways is a sort of stereotype in these sorts of things, but it's not that from the trees really. There is the sort of, this recruiting party turns up and it's kind of quite glamorous and kind of, they do a big sell job on, the local inhabitants about trying to, advertise basically what they're joining up for, the advantages of being a soldier and all these sorts of things. So there is that going on. There's certainly some sharp practices sometimes, so excuse the pun, of, people cutting corners and, here are the regulations, but that's not exactly how it's done. One of the things Horse Guards does do is actually try to enforce those regulations much more closely. And I think that gets to some of the sort of, the transformations that happen during this 20-year period is much tighter regulation of kind of recruitment, because the early 1790s in the first phase of the war, it does feel like an absolute free-for-all. and it's kind of, and although some of the things you think is kind of quite funny tricks and that sort of stuff, at the extreme end, it starts feeling like kind of people trafficking. They're kind of knocking people out, getting them drunk and chaining them up in rooms, and then saying you're in the army now. And it leads to riots in London and in other places too, where kind of recruiting sort of houses, the sort of bases that where a recruiting party might live for a bit, get attacked and pulled down and these sorts of stuff. So yeah, there's some awesome sort of sharp practice, but the basics are, someone decides to enlist, goes up to this recruiting party and does take kind of part of their bounty, which is the king's shilling. There is meant to be, and there was a phase afterwards where, within a day or two, they were meant to go before a magistrate and, if you like, a test, which is confirmed that they are going to actually join the army. Once that happens, they are kind of soldier. At that moment, also, they have a chance, the enlistee, if you like, to say, I've changed my mind. The tricky thing is they'd have to pay back any money that they'd already been given. Given how much drink is involved in the recruiting this period, is kind of, well, I was given all of this money, but I was told I was meant to spend it with all of my new buddies, or the rest of the recruiting party that I'm with. There's some kind of traditions and customs of becoming a soldier. So the chances of that happening is very rare. Interestingly, though, with that comes from a standard form recruiting. It might mean that they're actually still with their the party that recruited them quite a while. They're not sort of sent off immediately to some kind of training depot or something like that. Sometimes they were dispatched quite quickly. But often they would actually be with that recruiting party for a bit until they've got enough soldiers, enlistees, to kind of justify sending them to the regiment, or the recruiting party had thought it's got enough, men, and it would head back to the regiment. So it's a sort of weird phase where, they're in the army, but not with a unit. And that could, sometimes be a few months sometimes before they would actually get to the unit. And then they probably might start feeling the more formal process of actually kind of joining their unit and getting every piece to everything that they should have. One thing that Horse Guards does tighten up on, because as part of this process, as well as seeing the magistrate, they're meant to be seen by a surgeon as well to check off their physical conditions, basically. Are they the right height? Have they got any kind of, pre-existing injuries or anything like that? Just check them over physically. In the earlier days of the Revolutionary Wars, most recruiting parties could find a kind of sympathetic surgeon to kind of sign off pretty much anyone, judging by their inspection returns afterwards. And so what Horse Guards brings in is almost like a regional recruitment system, where areas kind of bigger than counties, sort of 3 or 4 counties, would have some kind of recruitment depot, and there would be a surgeon there who would check over new recruits, and he was employed by the military and separate from the unit, if you like, that was receiving them. So there's more oversight of that kind of process. They also introduced as part of that a system of sort of getting their bounties in stages rather than getting it all at once. They kind of go through each of these stages and get a bit more of their bounty, which should have stretched out that, here's the huge sum of cash that you've just got, into different stages, and allowed the army to sort of check on it as well. So that was kind of sort of how much, the process at an individual level. And for some soldiers, which we'll probably talk a bit more about somewhere along the line, those that were already in military service but not in the army. So the militiamen, for example, much more simpler process, if you like. It's more like a sort of transfer of, sort of HR files. They're making sure they finish being paid in their old regiment and they start being paid in the new regiment. But there were a lot of men who went through that process, but they would have gone through a similar sort of process in joining the militia in the first place. Slightly different though. You can ask me about that if you want to. But in terms of sort of, what the army thinks about, recruiting and how much time it spends on it. Certainly there's a lot of effort in the mid-1790s onwards to kind of be more strict about regulations. Probably a little bit less about training and these sorts of things. We can talk about that. I think it's a question coming up. But also there is an interesting dilemma that the army has. That form of recruiting, the typical Sharpe sending parties out and, They wander around town looking for men, is a drain on the army. That actually you're taking men and sergeants and sometimes officers out of serving units and forcing, making them wander around the country looking for people. So they do try and find other ways of finding men. Don't involve draining manpower like that, which there is a kind of sort of, they find a sort of natural limit to it, I think. Certainly by the Peninsular War period, they realise if you just keep adding more and more recruiting parties, you don't get more and more soldiers. It's not a simple linear kind of, actually, if we need 10,000 more soldiers this year, we'll send out another 1,000 recruiting parties and therefore we'll get. It just doesn't work like that.
Kevin, I just want to follow up on that. It's really interesting, actually, you talk about the recruiting parties themselves. Because it's something that I've come across in my research in the National Archives. You'll often see in, muster lists on recruiting different ranks and things like that. And I just wondered, how are those guys selected for those recruiting parties? Is it a reward? Is it you've done really well, or you've been sick, or you've fought, you've been brave, or is it just a lottery?
I don't think we really know. There's not much written about it. I think for the NCOs, there's probably a sense within units about who is good at it. And, it becomes a kind of, perhaps they try some out and then they prove to be very good at it. So they send them out again and again. So you do see, like as you mentioned, the kind of, the muster books, it's the same kind of sergeants, NCOs and jobbers going off and doing this duty. So it feels like they've sort of specialised in there. How they get to that point is a very interesting question. Sergeants don't appear out of nowhere. So what were their stories? I mean, we'd have to go back and do some of the things we talked about, really, which is what kind of that we need personal biographies reconstructed for all these people to then see, right, where did they start and what was the first time they went recruiting and who with? It's something we don't know that much about, I think, about who gets chosen to these things. It's a really interesting question, and I think it was essentially starting to feel more specialised in this period. That some NCOs would see this as kind of their job, and that's what they're in their unit for, is to go out and recruit. And certainly with the demands that regiments had, they couldn't afford to turn down someone who was good at that job. So if they find someone who's good at it, they would keep making use of them, I think, because it was sometimes very difficult for them to get men.
With all of this in mind, the thing that keeps coming back in my head is why, again, myth busting, scum of the earth thing, it looms large over.
I wonder where that's going to come up.
Yeah. Well, it's bound to, isn't it? Because this is the problem with Wellington and opinions, because he's got strong opinions on everything, and he is Wellington. Everybody listens to him and thinks he's right. And I don't want to kind of drill down into the fabric of the scum of the earth comment itself. We've done that on other episodes. But what interests me is that he talks about a perception, and I'm curious about whether this is Wellington as a standalone, just sort of standing on his soapbox and being too vocal, or whether he's giving voice to an undercurrent that exists elsewhere amongst officers of perhaps a certain class, or perhaps the officer corps more generally, that, these guys are so far below us, they might as well be licking our boots. That's all they're good for, kind of thing. Or actually, maybe they're not even good for that because, I don't want scum on my boots, kind of thing. Do you know what I mean? And none of that works with what we know about command and control. So where does that perception come from, do you think? Is Wellington just kind of this lone wolf voice that we pay too much attention to? Or do you think there is some kind of undercurrent where people just don't understand the realities of what's going on in much wider society that is giving these guys the impetus to join the army in the first place?
I think you're right about what you just said at the end there, that, Wellington is probably alone with, I'm sure there's some others had very similar views to him, but he's, said it most succinctly. But I think more generally, not understanding the world that all of these men came from. Very much so. I think it probably was completely alien to a lot of officers about their backgrounds and experience and why they joined up. And I think that, as you say, doesn't pose issues about command and control, but then there is a little bit, actually, in some ways, the sort of slates are wiped clean once they join the army. that, all right, there is this big caste distinction within the army, but that doesn't necessarily stop soldiers, these people going on to become good soldiers. But also, I think, and this is where Ed Koss's work is really interesting, that actually sometimes some of the material, quite a lot of material, particularly about campaigns, it feels like the enlisted men are learning how to survive as a group on their own, which is almost separate from the officers. The officers do their bit, there's things on the kind of battlefield in terms of pointing in the right direction and, barking orders and actually, but kind of getting through things. It feels like a very closed community. And they realise actually one of the best ways of getting through it is to be highly disciplined, is to be kind of very good at drill and to kind of do things very quickly when they get, told to, particularly when they start trusting the military abilities of the officers. That's why Wellington kind of does succeed in that respect. He kind of tries to get away with some of these comments because they trust his kind of military abilities, and they know that they're more likely to actually come out of that combat situation. More and more probable to come out of that actually still alive. They kind of do the things they're being asked because they prove to be successful. But yeah, that is in a very kind of close relationship with kind of officers and the kind of, big decisions that are going on the army. It's more kind of, realise this. And I think that does speak to kind of a bit about who all these people are as well. Again, we're generalising. That they did have their own world they lived in, and sometimes it's quite tricky to get into because they don't leave too much documentation about it. But it is very closely linked probably to their previous experiences of working life, basically, in, 18th century Britain, which was very kind of class divided, economic divided, had distinct customs and, expectations about how you would behave, but also what you could expect back as well.
And just staying with that kind of theme of customs and societal expectations, something that we often talk about on this show is that notion of scarlet fever. And from a familial kind of situation, you've got your loved one, they're about to go off to war. Everybody knows what that entails. So there's one strata of society that's going to be quite kind of concerned. You've got another section of society that supposedly, at least from the legend that's been handed down to us, is looking at these guys in redcoats thinking, oh dear, I'm terribly flustered right now. But then we also have this more general perception that the army isn't a respectable career. So how do those completely kind of contrasting pools of thought manage to coexist within society?
I understand the big ones actually today, aren't they? Well, in some ways, I suppose they vary at different moments and for different things as well. So the scarlet fever kind of, hearts all aflutter and all of these sorts of things about seeing a man in a red coat, that can quite easily apply to all those forces who stayed within Britain and Ireland and were kind of wandering around the country, kind of defending hearth and home. You can see how that worked. For those that then kind of, I'm about to get on this ship, be sent to the Caribbean, you'll probably never see me again. Yeah, scarlet fever is really going to be top of your kind of mind there, I think. There a lot depends, I think, on, the context of the soldier or the stereotype of the soldier they're looking at. So some are those kind of ones that spend a lot of time in that attitude. But others would be completely different kind of behaviour or kind of attitudes towards them because they would feel like, well, actually, if I'm saying goodbye to them, it might really be the last time I ever see them again, because of where they're being sent. And certainly some of the newspaper reports, which, have to sort of take with a pinch of salt, but you do get that sense of some of these things were heart-wrenching, I think, in terms of those regiments being sent overseas and families, on lining the kind of docks and these sorts of things, saying goodbye to them. There is, they kind of coexisting and kind of pop in different ways in different circumstances, I think. And the respectability one is a really interesting one, I think, about, because, there is this sort of general sense of unease about people joining the armed forces. But on the other hand, some efforts to try and make it more attractive. And, scarlet fever is being played up a bit, I think, because of that. But also the other things they try and do in terms of sort of military careers and giving enlisted men more opportunities to kind of get promoted into different roles, receive some sort of honours and things like Chelsea pension. So sometimes the respectability, I think it depends on context and place and background of the people involved, I think.
Kevin, I think that's an interesting point to follow up with this. And with those recruits, that it's that caricature almost, isn't it? That the recruiting party comes into the village and off they go and they're not seen again for years. But, how much information were these men given on things like, their terms of service, the sort of expectations of military life? I'm sure it is a little bit of a myth that it's not just as simple as signing on and then disappearing, but like how much information would then these guys been able to give their families and their communities, on signing on the dotted line?
In terms of service kind of point is really interesting. One thing that does come out, and I think it links very much to the sort of working culture of the era, certainly in kind of Britain and Ireland, is a real sense sometimes of it being a contract that they were signing with the army. And in some cases, so if you have Rory on, if you haven't already had Rory on, to talk about defensibles, when those terms and conditions are being broken, this leading to really big issues, kind of mutinies, particularly in the Defence War into the 1790s. But then later on in the periods, you see less of those kind of mass protests, which actually looked at in a different way. It looked like industrial disputes, looks like a strike. Kind of like, we did not sign up for this, so we're downing weapons, and until you agree to go back to the old conditions, the conditions we signed up to, we're not leaving. What you see more later on, I think, is soldiers deserting because they feel that the kind of contract is broken. Not that they explicitly say, I'm off because, I'm not being paid. You can kind of sort of see the ebbs and flows of desertion sometimes and how that relates to other things that are going on. And it is kind of, this is not what I signed up for. So I think they do have a very strong sense of both literal kind of, my terms of service, for example, defensibles, where I was only going to serve in Scotland when you're asking me to march to England, or I was only going to serve in Britain and you're asking me to go to Ireland. But also more general senses of kind of customary practice. This is what the deal I thought it was going to be. We're not getting paid, we're not getting fed, that sort of stuff. Or some other things can be that the bond lecture more about something, expectations around service. It's very costly to be a soldier here. So some places, for example, like the Channel Islands, you see people deserting from there, which takes some doing, which kind of had to kind of, not only kind of escape the kind of military garrison, then find a boat and then kind of try and get somewhere else. It's kind of, they really wanted to do it. But they're saying it's because it's just too expensive to be a soldier there, because their pay doesn't cover other things that they would like to have as a soldier. Whether it be sort of drink, extra bits of food, extra rations, whatever it might be. It's kind of, it's too costly here. This is not, it's not part of the deal, and so you see kind of moments, I think, ripples of that in different ways about terms and conditions. More general sort of senses of being a soldier, and expectations about what, being a soldier would be like. I think recruiting parties often overpromised and, the army under-delivers. They're going to get to see the world. They'll get, enormous amounts of plunder wherever they go and be able to return back home, both a hero and rich, kind of, have this glorious life afterwards. They also promise quite a bit sometimes about Chelsea pensions. So, they will get to be pensioners. And that's actually a lot harder to get than most people think. So there's a lot of that going on. More generally about the sort of, being a soldier, I think it all depends on sometimes the sort of the context. I mean, as we talked right at the start, there probably were some members of communities, villages and towns who had been soldiers who could talk to soldiers about, or enlistees, what life was like, which might have actually inspired them to go and do things. But I think the reality would be very different from all of those kind of stories. From actually a lot of being a soldier, some things don't change that much. It's about kind of, being in garrison, waiting around for things, drill, so many kind of had these big moments of kind of combat that may occur. The last thing I probably would say about the sort of expectations is a very negative one. And this does link to Zach's point about respectability, is they were aware of places where it was ineffective as a one-way ticket if you were sent to there. This is particularly the Caribbean. There's huge fear among soldiers and enlistees about being sent to the Caribbean because of catching yellow fever and all sorts of the other health problems that soldiers had from there. There's a fearsome reputation of being sent to the Caribbean. So I think they had that very negative kind of expectation that if that happened, the chances were, they probably wouldn't come back. So there is that some awareness of all these sort of different elements of where the army goes. Never sort of sure exactly of what their lives would be, I think.
So I will be restrained and resist the temptation to now ask you about to what extent you believe military law is an example of employment law, because we've had that conversation in an exclusive episode. And like the jury's out on that anyway. But I'm going to ask a Liam-esque question, and I'm going to get nerdy about training and training methods. So this might actually end up being a question for both of you in terms of kind of feeding off of each other on this. I guess what are the established training methods for recruits is an important starting point, and how long does that process take? But also I'm curious about things like standardization, differences between different arms of the service, also whether there are sort of cherished traditions. We talk about, for example, the rifles being so much more egalitarian. Do they try and build that in from day one and sort of try and lay off in terms of these perceptions about brutality and sort of getting smacked around the back of the head if you can't drill properly? We might know that that's not a very good way of motivating people, but we're dealing in a different time. We're dealing in a world where flogging is the main form of punishment that the army's looking at. So do you see these differences that end up playing out in terms of how training is actually implemented? And equally, Liam, from your perspective, what do you hear historians kind of talking about certain tropes on training, which as somebody who has actually trained soldiers, just simply don't work because they can't work from a human perspective?
Okay, where do I start? I'm kind of really conscious Liam's in the room, so he's going to be smiling at me and some things. I think starting with the basic training, certainly for basic training for, regiments for the infantrymen, was very kind of well established in terms of regulation and drill books and bouts and progressions from even just basic things about how to stand. I think quite kind of obsessed about kind of, physical kind of how soldiers should hold themselves. Then adding in kind of, well, how do you hold the weapon? How do you hold the musket? And how do you go through the firing kind of individual sequences to actually firing it? Liam will say a lot more about that than I ever can. And then from that, building up to how do you do that when you're in a small group, of kind of, 12 people, so 6 people in the front rank, 6 people in the back. And then it gets larger and larger and larger until you build up to battalion size kind of drill. And there is a great emphasis in the army and certainly the regulations at the time of just repetition of this. I'll be interested to see what your insights about this are, Luke. My sense is that it looks really, really pedantic, and in some ways it could be taken as really, really pedantic, and I'm sure there were massive pendants about this. But on the other hand, there's some strength in the psychological conformity, I think, of being able to all do this. It gives to soldiers sort of some, not necessarily anonymity and not necessarily comfort, but kind of alliance with the other people around them, I think. That you'll all be able to do the same thing at the same time in the same way. And that actually helps. It's more likely to mean that you survive a battle through doing this, particularly for the infantrymen, I think. And so this sort of emphasis on repetition is not just kind of, the intricacies of drill. It feels more psychological, physiological. It's kind of muscle memory and kind of just, you don't have to think about doing this, you're just doing this. Because when you're in that kind of combat environment, you do not want to be checking your drill regulation book about what exactly comes after this to make sure we get into this square before we get cut to pieces by cavalry, for example. It needs to almost be kind of instinctive. It's literally drilled into them, I think, that they know how to respond to these situations. So I think there is, there is a good deal of regulation already for the infantry, and well-established practices about how to do this. I think it's stretched well back into the 18th century because it's all tied in with kind of musket drill and how to deliver a firepower most effectively with the number of men you've got and the space that you have and all these sorts of things. Cavalry is a little bit more interesting, that there's less regulation at the start of the period. It becomes more regulated. Dundas brings out a drill book in 1795, which tries to do some of the things they've done with the infantry about how to arrange units, how to have all these different formations and how to move from one formation to another quickly and kind of trying to regulate that. Probably less successful. A bit like the musket drill, the marching drill, or the marching that brings in the sword drill, which is generally regarded as pretty good actually in terms of, again, equipping soldiers with those reflexes about how to use a sword as a weapon. You don't have to think too much about it. The one they completely miss out about is horse riding, which I kind of think is quite important for cavalry, but they don't really do very much about how to actually ride a horse and how to combine all those things together at the same time. The British Army, there's a real dearth then about equitation, as it's called. So there is no standardization of that. There might be the sort of the best rider in the unit that try and teach the other enlisted men about how to ride horses. So you see quite idiosyncratic practices there. What we know least about, thinking about the other ones, is artillery as well, really. Lots of kind of books about, how to use different bits of ordnance. They were probably being used, and some of those are made into sort of more accessible books for artillerymen. Most of them would probably be, probably were able to read these sorts of things. But actually what drill they went through, what training they had, I haven't yet managed to find very much out about that. So I really need to do a study of the artillery. There's a PhD waiting out there about, how they were trained to do their job. The one small interesting fact about them is they weren't always paired with the same equipment all the time. So it seems like they would probably have to be actually very flexible in actually what roles they had in manning a gun, and what guns they were using, and where they were using and how they were using. There's an expectation almost that any artillery company, which is kind of like a battery, could turn up and use any piece of equipment they could find. Though they were kind of tied, they did get to established ordnance, but yes, tied to particular units. Generally, there's a thing there should be, otherwise a sort of universal artillery. I'd be surprised if that actually panned out that way, but there's no kind of specialization of training for it to be a field gun or to be a garrison gun or to be someone who uses mortars or someone who uses siege guns.
Yeah, Kevin, I think you're absolutely right. What you say about the repetition and that kind of removing a person's. No, you are. I mean, by removing someone's anonymity in that sense, removing someone's personality and making them part of this anonymous machine, that it does. I think it's part of becoming a soldier. You remove certain elements of someone's civilian personality in order to conform everyone into this, dare I say, sort of big red block for our period. And like you say, that building of that muscle memory, it isn't only key for combat because, like you say, no one wants to be looking at the manual sort of, how do we form square again? Which end of the ramrod do I use first?
Yeah.
No one wants to be doing that, but also it's that safety in numbers thing, isn't it? And that by being functional in your section or your subdivision or your company or your battalion, whichever sort of subunit of the army you want to play at this, by being competent in that role, that you are more likely to survive, your comrades are more likely to survive, and you are therefore more likely to make it home or to gain notoriety, to get some plunder, to all of the positive things only happen by working together. I think it's really interesting. You look at that carrot and stick situation Because it's a really difficult one. And I know the army's changed a lot in sort of, 250 years. But there are some occasions where sometimes people need a fairly stark reminder of what's wrong and what's right. And I'm not an advocate for corporal punishment at all. But how where do you draw the line on that? Where do you sort of say, well, actually, flogging is obviously horrific, but in a time and in a society where that's actually a fairly common practice of it's not like it's a shocking thing for the time, right? Like someone to be publicly whipped or publicly flogged for a transgression. And I know, Zach would be able to, talk about Zach, throwing me under the bus and then starting a crime and punishment rabbit hole. But like, I'd be really interested to look at the occurrences of reoffenders, because I won't necessarily say on the pod, but I've had a couple of starts in my early army career, shall we say, and I learned from them. You know what I mean? Yeah. There's a few occasions where, well, I definitely won't be doing that again. And I'm sure guys in the sort of late 18th, early 19th century learned from that as well. It's really interesting you talk about the military equitation there, that training of cavalry, because I think it is much easier to train someone who has an awareness of horses and not necessarily the ability to ride. It's easier to then teach them to ride in a military fashion than to have someone come in who's, ridden forever and super experienced, and then try and mold them again, break those civilian practices down and mold them into what we want.
I think that's an interesting one, because for the cavalrymen, the enlisted men, there wasn't any requirement that they, knew how to ride a horse or anything like that beforehand. No expectation that horses might have done. But for the officers, you're looking at a very different and group of people, as you say, pretty much all of them, we knew how to ride. Certainly when it comes to the cavalry. And sometimes you do look at some of the accounts about the cavalry and think, well, the sort of training and where they're doing, and you think they're kind of just treating this like another hunt. This is kind of, it's all about sort of speed and being able to gallop and jump over things and stuff. And that is not going to help on the battlefield. Though it does explain a lot about the British cavalry sometimes. They didn't unlearn those sort of civilian practices, I think. And actually one person who did write about it, got his name, but it was in the First Life Guards, was an officer, basically complained about this. Saying, if you want to be a good cavalry officer, a cavalryman, you've got to unlearn everything you've learned about horse riding beforehand, because it is really different to do that en masse in a cavalry regiment, to do all those things you just talked about, Liam, and to do that with horses as well, to do it with an animal, it is a completely different sort of, behaviours you need for that.
Liam's teased me with a crime and punishment, almost like a ferret, to encourage me to scamper off on this one. And I'll be honest, I don't have some significant data in terms of how recruits are treated to be able to talk about things like repeat offenders. Not least because I suspect that when it came to recruits, unless they were doing something really severe like deserting, they weren't really going to end up in front of a regimental court-martial, far less a general court-martial, which then leads us to a question of, well, how are these guys being molded? And if there is a physicality to the way in which these guys are kind of told, no, you're not doing it that way, what does that look like? Does that mean that from very early on, they're introduced to something like company courts-martial, that level of court that technically legally doesn't really exist, but it's there and they're doing it. And so you get this kind of acclimatization early on of trial by peers, because that's really what the company courts-martial facilitates. It's a group of your sergeants and NCOs, the people who are drawn from that same strata of society as you. Now, the bottom line is we don't know. We know virtually nothing about the company courts-martial as it is. And so this is sort of lots of speculation. But I wonder if you've got any sense of how recruits are actually treated when they get something wrong. Do we have any evidence of this?
Very, very little. I think much in the same way that you find, except when things go wrong, and it usually tends to be either that they're, this unit's falling apart, so they there's a sense that something hasn't gone right in terms of recruiting. There hasn't been some form of discipline imposed upon them. You certainly see that in some of the units in the early 1790s that are raised out of nothing, and there's basically 800 newbies in it. No one knows what they're doing, and someone comes and inspects them, and there's kind of very clear you can't carry on like this. They don't go into specifics about what they should do to remedy it. There's a sense of that. And similarly, I think for the other way around, some of the inspection returns that we've talked about before, seeing comments on that from general officers saying that the officers and the NCOs are being too harsh sometimes on new recruits. That this is a new battalion, or it is has lots of new recruits in it, so they need to be a bit gentler on. We don't know what the harshness is or the gentler is. We don't know what they mean by those things. Whether that is kind of, literal kind of, need to ease off on the physical punishments, or just the kind of the physicality of how they're training, or is it just about the training regime? They drilling them too much, so they're not picking up fast enough, or they're not getting a chance to. It's kind of acclimatized to being a soldier, the routines of life. But there is like I say, with the company court martial, there's a sense that there is something out there that is going on, which is doing this. And when you get to the extremes of it, you could see, yes, they know what it should be like, but they don't tell us what that is in the middle, what that sweet spot is that means, this is how much, which is what's acceptable. This is what tends to work with new recruits, from the backgrounds we just talked about. We just don't have that evidence, unfortunately.
So we've touched on previous episodes, Kevin, about how, integral the regimental system is within the way that the army operated during the period. And I really want to sort of dive into this regimental identity thing at this recruit stage, and how much awareness, I guess, if any, would these men have had about the regiments that they were joining? Things like battlefield reputation or location of overseas service. You touched earlier on service in the West Indies, for example. How much awareness would these guys have had or been given by the recruiting parties? I guess it's a double-edged sword in that sense.
Yeah. My sense is actually quite a lot, I think. There were, and some of it's kind of negative evidence I've got for this, if you like. The army introduced or tried to introduce a system of general service where they just recruit men, and then they send them to any unit that they want to afterwards. And this proved massively unpopular. It didn't recruit anywhere near the kind of, the numbers that people expected from it. So that's the kind of sort of evidence that people were thinking about regiments. And I think you were talking about, what did people know? I think recruiting parties did go in and make an effort to kind of sell their regiments and play up to some of the reputations. I mean, not all of them have the same ability to be able to do that. It's fair enough to say. So some of the, the more flamboyantly dressed cavalry regiments are already onto a winner because they could just turn up and say, look, join up and this is what you get to wear, guys. You get to dress as a hussar. Other regiments could play on, their traditions, and recruitment posters and the adverts you see in newspapers are really interesting for that, and sort of saying, this is a great regiment and look at all the victories it's had, or it is commanded sometimes by a particular person as well. That can make a difference. That, there's some sort of, notoriety for that particular person that's in charge of it. They do also sometimes play up kind of some regional connections too. And obviously these are kind of emphasised very much in units like the Highland regiments and some Irish regiments. But also things like the Royal Fusiliers in London, kind of sort of see as a close association with particular places. Some of the associations, though, completely run antithetical to actually the title of the regiment. So the Warwickshire Regiment was the second. No, the first Warwickshire, the 6th Regiment was first. Had a really strong presence of people from Lancashire. Nothing to do with Warwickshire. But it's kind of like, for some reason, they built this kind of community of people who recruited from Lancashire, and they would keep going back to Lancashire to recruit because of that. And probably made an emphasis of the fact that, come and join other Lancastrians. Even though we're the first Warwickshire Regiment, just ignore that bit. But so there was some, sort of community building almost, or trying to build that sort of into recruitment. Yeah, you mentioned about the Caribbean, and as I say, I think, new recruits were really aware, or tried to be as aware as they could be about units that were there and avoiding those. And there is a massive dip in recruitment in the mid 1790s, basically because most of the army is in the Caribbean, and it just puts people off. And they're seeing and hearing all of the reports and the casualties quite clearly. It always doesn't matter which unit of the army you're joining. That, particularly if you're joining as an infantryman, you probably would end up being sent there. So there is a problem there. The soldiers, enlistees, are definitely aware of that. And then you have regiments like the Guards. They're obviously kind of much more aware, I think, as an enlistee. You've got to meet certain standards to actually be able to get into the Guards. But also the chances of being sent somewhere like the Caribbean or South Asia or even Australia are extremely, extremely slim. There's always no chance that's going to happen. And I think with, as the Peninsular War goes on as well, particularly from those men who transferred from the militia into the regular army, a real sense of they were quite savvy about actually which regiments they would want to join because they could choose again. And were picking ones that were doing the fighting in the Peninsula. I mean, there was actually the one that needed the manpower, but also were quite deliberately going for some of those units, particularly the light regiments, 40th and 52nd, and of course the rifles. I mean, the rifles is incredibly popular with former militiamen. Almost a whole battalion was formed out of them, I think in 1809, because it was so popular. Not that it stays, all of them, but kind of they had enough numbers to create the third battalion. And there are a couple of others that sort of are slightly different from that perspective. One of them, I think, is just testing my memory here, I think it's the 56th, but of 3 battalions. Most of the men were sent to South Asia. And I think there's quite an emphasis there on kind of, well, if that's where you want to go, and the lifestyle will be very different there. But it has quite a lot of positives for, a white soldier in South Asia in the British Army, that they were trading off that, I think. That actually, you could go, all right, you might not have come back, but this is the life that you could have in South Asia as a soldier of the 56th. So it's not always just about the kind of, famous regiments and big battles and successes. It can sometimes be about opportunities and lifestyle a little bit as well.
This is the joy of doing interviews like this, because that final response has just opened up a whole series of neurons in my brain about the role that recruitment is clearly having in terms of the trickle-down effect and kind of forging regimental identity. Yes. Because you've got, as you say, these recruiting parties, and we would all expect these recruiting parties to sort of loudly proclaim the virtues of their particular regiment, but it had never really struck me that will then plant a seed. Because people will believe it.
Yeah.
Probably. I mean, sure, that they're bound to take it with a pinch of salt. But that then starts the myth making.
Yeah.
And therefore the sort of the wider society's identification with particular regiments and their reputations. And I really hadn't sort of paused to dwell on that before. So I've enjoyed this episode. And ultimately it's all about me. Folks, I know you'll have enjoyed this episode as well. Massive thank you, as ever, to Kevin for not only coming on and giving us the benefit of his time for this episode, but also for the entire series. And we have, Liam, is it like another 12 of these lined up? I've lost track at this point.
I mean, yeah, we've got at least, I think, 8. We've got another part coming up on the rank and file. Part it'll be part 5, Act 2, as it were, will be our next installment. But there's just so much to unpack, and some of these stories are so interesting that to sort of dive into them to the level that Kevin can. I mean, we'd be crazy not to, right?
We absolutely would. Folks, you know how you can thank Kevin for his time. Head over to Pen and Sword, where you can get your hands on the British Army, that fantastic, now award-winning book. So please go to the Pen and Sword website for that. We will stick the details in the descriptor. And also his book on the Britain and Wellington's Army is available from Palgrave Macmillan for those who fancy going to a title that is perhaps a little bit more academic in its sort of layout. Also, perhaps its price tag as well.
Yeah.
Very sorry, but is absolutely worth it. It is an indispensable volume. It sits on my shelf and gets thumbed heavily because of its utility. But also, GeorgianArmyOfficers.org, completely free. So if you want to just go and explore the careers of some of these guys, then that is a beautiful resource. Kevin, huge thanks once again for your time. Folks, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. We will be back very soon. Did you enjoy this episode? Be sure to subscribe so that you can find your way back to us. If you want to stay up to date with all the latest news from the show, sign up to our mailing list. The link is in the description. And don't forget that you can enjoy early access, exclusive episodes, online courses, and much, much more on Patreon. The link is in the description. And if you're looking for personalized merch for the Napoleonic nerd in your life, drop us a line on social media and we can design something for you. Shout outs to our patrons who, at the time of recording in mid-May 2025, were in the mentioned in dispatches tier, Brendan Teeling, Beatrice de Graaf, Lynn Dawson, Jim Deary, Josh Keeney, Colin Fieldhouse, Jim Getz, Jeff Maple, Robin Brasher, Indiana Fats, Stephen Gillen, Hugh Brennan, Alistair Campbell-Grieve, Andy Meakin, Mark Anscombe, Rob Coughlin, Bruins Girl, Noah Fink, Miles Reedy, Nick Overland, Graham Goodwin, Chris Pramas, Anthony Gumbau, Ian Harding, Anonymous American, James Fluick, Natasha Hobday, Rod Schwager, Chris Kimball, Gary Dennis, Ted Andrews, Richard Anderson, Arthur Forgy, Sam Moore, Wyatt Pollock, Joe Ayres, Darla Vincent, Peter Findlay, Giovanni, Steve Gillen, Jean-Baptiste Van Merlen, Daniel Friedman, Neil Reed, Jonathan Willits, and Wojciech Stefanovic. The Admirals, John Haynes, Mike Guest, Rachel Stark, Mark Duckers, David Priest, Graham Callister, Sean Sullivan, Stephen Ashworth, Reto the Sci-Fi Fan, Tim Day, Jason Morn, and Tim Pritchard. The Chiefs of Staff, David Maxwell and Adam Coslin, the Marshals, Ryan Diamond and JC Kaiser, and in the Legion to Scholars tier, Kate Walcombe, Clemens Beman, Dan Hazelwood, and Bob Burnham, and in the Crown Yourself tier, Emperor of the First French Empire, Todd Campbell, and Duke of Wellington, Laird Campbell. We'll be back very soon, but until then, this has been the Napoleonic Wars Pod. On behalf of myself, Liam, Luke, and Josh, take care of yourselves, folks. Stay well, and as always, thank you for listening.